Earlier today, I told you a little bit about my work. As a litigator, I work on all kinds of disputes, but about 80% of my current workload is advising on historical child sexual abuse claims arising from institutional settings, such as churches. Before I go any further, I want to give you a heads up that some of the things I might say may be, will be, should be uncomfortable. And in a group of this size, I know that there may be some survivors in the room, relatives of survivors. So if people get up and walk out at any time, that is completely okay and will not be taken personally, and you got to do what you got to do. Sadly, as the Royal Commission laid bare, the sexual abuse of children has been a dark smear on the history of many Australian organisations, whether they be churches, schools, orphanages, sporting clubs or other not-for-profit entities. While sexual abuse claims used to be statute barred due to the effluxion of time, a change in legislation in 2018 removed the limitation period such that now anyone who was sexually abused as a child in an institutional setting, even if that abuse happened 50 years ago, can sue the institution in which the abuse happened for compensatory damages. Usually the basis of the claim is that the institution breached its duty of care to the plaintiff by failing to provide a safe environment and to protect that person from sexual abuse. It doesn't matter that child protection standards were less stringent, and in some cases certainly non-existent. Institutions can still be liable for breach of duty of care, and in some cases, if the perpetrator or perpetrators, as the case may be, was an employee of the organisation, that organisation can be held vicariously liable for the abuse. And so we're not talking about just the abuse and the subsequent damage to the person who was abused. This change in legislation has opened the floodgates, such that thousands of plaintiffs have commenced civil actions against churches and other entities for the ways in which those organisations failed them. If the perpetrators are still alive, which is rare due to the passage of time, then sometimes they are also named as defendants in the proceedings. My job is to weigh up all of the evidence of the effect of that childhood sexual abuse on the plaintiff during his or her life to determine what the quantum or the value of the claim is. That means that sometimes I'm looking at decades worth of evidence to see just how detrimental this person's experience was. I have to read every detail of the abuse as pleaded in the court documents and form a view on the nature and extent of the harm that it inevitably caused the plaintiff. This usually involves reviewing extensive medical records and psychiatric reports, detailing the plaintiff's injuries and the effect that those injuries had upon the person's career, relationships and social life. As you would expect, those accounts are absolutely harrowing. On a daily basis, I have a front row seat to the most grievous criminal activity against children, including by perpetrators who purport to be people of faith. To make matters worse, sometimes these perpetrators use their position as a faith leader to also spiritually abuse, groom, or otherwise control their victim. Usually, I can separate emotion from the facts that I read. But, let me tell you, when an adult in a position of spiritual authority has perverted the character of God to control their victim. It makes my blood boil. That kind of behaviour is so far removed from who God is that I feel utter contempt and a really deep sadness for not only the person whose life I'm reading about, but also for how badly God has been misrepresented. And actually in some of these claims, people go into a fair bit of detail about their loss of faith, how this happening to them or happening within their family has actually caused many people to walk away from God entirely, as you would expect. It all sounds pretty dire, doesn't it? And it is to a point. Unless you live under a rock, every Christian is exposed to and has to make sense of the sadness and the suffering that typify our world on this side of eternity. Earlier, I told you that I love my work and I feel like I'm serving from my sweet spot. You might be wondering how on earth or why that is the case when the job is marred by stories of such significant pain and brokenness, sometimes caused by people who profess to have the same faith that I do. Here's how I cope. This is the good stuff. This is what I want to tell you about. First, my Christian worldview gives me a clear understanding of why bad things happen. 1 Peter 5:8 tells me that Satan prowls the earth like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. Likewise, in John 10:10, we are told that the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. I understand that we are in the midst of the great controversy and that the enemy's main desire is to cause us to doubt that God is good and that he has our best interests at heart. These things taken together, while these harrowing accounts of abuse cause me to sometimes question God's lack of intervention, I'm not surprised that the abuse occurred. Does that make sense? I can process those instances as acts of pure evil because I know we live in a fallen world. Second, I believe that Jesus came to earth to mend the brokenhearted and to set things right once and for all. One day soon, there'll be no more crying, pain, or suffering. This is a really important expectation that we have to hold on to, including that one day the survivors who've been so badly harmed by the powers of evil will have a chance at a fresh start. Their psychological wounds will be bound up, their addictions quelled, and their minds and bodies made new and whole in Jesus. I'm deeply, deeply comforted by that fact. And reassured that despite humanity's depravity, Jesus has already put in motion a plan to undo the evil in our world. Third, I believe that God invites us to get our hands dirty and participate in the work of setting things right. Christians pray that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And let me tell you, that is exactly the prayer that I pray over each of the files that I open every day. Not only does that prayer comfort me, but I believe it authorises God to intervene in the litigation process, which, though slow and imperfect in its own right, offers that individual a chance to receive an apology and compensation, which may help them make a new start or a better life for themselves. While no amount of compensation is sufficient to address the suffering of the survivors, even mere tokens can sometimes make a difference in people's lives. The process is also good for defendant organisations because it sometimes compels them, kicking and screaming, to confront their own failings, learn from the past, and ensure that we put in place appropriate policies and procedures to mitigate the risk of the same things happening in the future. Finally, even though the work is confronting and the risk of vicarious trauma is real, apparently, I believe that God helps people of faith do hard things. And then he sustains us in the work. Whereas some of my colleagues have been unable to work on these types of claims for more than 6 months at a time, having to stop and do something else. By the grace of God, so far I've fared relatively well and am able to go home and, importantly, keep attending church without taking my work with me. I'm very grateful for that, and I really hope and pray that continues. I want to encourage you that God is extremely interested in how you spend your time. He wants you to find meaning and purpose in your work. And if he leads you to a new opportunity, even if the work is challenging or unpalatable, then he will equip you for it. That hard work may bring up more questions than answers for you. And that's certainly to be expected. And we have to accept that some things will never make sense until we get to heaven. So we should make peace with and learn to exist in that uncertainty. We don't have to have answers for everything. The question which was so eloquently put by Tim yesterday is, are you willing to trust? I pray that for you and me, our answer will continue to be yes.